So you see there's a link, and the 2008 and 2011 corresponded to extreme stable lobes in the jet stream and extremes of weather. So the extremes the story, if it's not 100% linked, but the sea ice retreat and the associated warming of the Arctic leads to a slower jet stream, which leads to lobes in the jet stream, which leads to extreme warm and cold events, which leads to more expensive food, loss of food production in mid-latitudes, more expensive food, and that leads to riots and war. So it's a pretty nasty set of causal linkages, and if all of those links are valid, then that's very bad. We're in a very bad state because this can only get worse. I'll show you how it can get worse. And again, I mentioned this yesterday because I couldn't really believe it, but it is true. It's a projection by the UN they've got a World Population Prospects. It's a report by the UN in 2015 giving the current and projected populations of different regions of the world between 2015 and 2100. So this came out wrong, but North America, for instance, in 2015 had 358 million people. In 2100, it's projected to have 500 million. South America, 634 to 721. So North America and South America are growing in population, but relatively slowly. Europe actually decreases in population, according to this projection, because it's getting to be an old continent and people aren't having so many children. Asia is growing, but not that fast. Oceania is growing. But you see the biggest growth, and the almost unbelievable figure, is Africa, which grows from 1186, 1,186 million today, to 4.387 billion by the end of the century. Now, that's a quadrupling of the population in a continent which can't feed itself now, and it already is dependent on overseas aid whenever there's a famine, or even without a famine. And also huge numbers of people are trying to leave Africa all the time. As is paying to be put onto boats that drift across the Mediterranean and sink. There's a huge pressure to get out of Africa because of the fact it offers no future for young people, and offers potential famine and starvation. And these numbers are just so huge. They can't, in a sense, they can't be credible, because if Africa can't feed itself now, if it has 4 times as many people, it obviously won't be able to feed itself, and it won't be able to get the food aid it needs from the rest of the world, because the rest of the world will also be in trouble, and countries that traditionally supply a lot of food aid, like the United States, might not be in a position to do so. So you would have real famine and starvation. So the population clearly can't reach 4 billion. Something will happen, and whatever happens will be very, very nasty. But the rest of the world can avoid that on the whole with sort of improvements in agriculture. These relatively modest, or they're not modest, they're quite high, but compared to Africa, these modest increases in population can maybe be fed and taken care of, but Africa, that can't be the case. So there's an awful thing happening in Africa, according to this UN report. Just at a time when the food supply is threatened. I mean, the Green Revolution did give you an increase in food production that stayed ahead of population. But if we have global warming at the level that we fear we're going to have, then independent of these weather extremes, we're going to have a reduced yields for all the standard crops that we use at the moment. And this is some estimates of how the yield changes as the global temperature rises from pre-industrial levels. So it's already 1 degree above pre-industrial level. So we can see that there's wheat, temperate wheat according to this, continues to give a greater yield up to 1.5 degrees of warming. Then it starts going down. Everything else is already going down at 1 degree. And then the rate of decrease of yield increases quite fast as we get up to 4 degrees, which is what everybody's expecting the Earth to be warmed up by the end of the century in reality. So you're going to have big decreases in percentage yields of major crops, corresponding just to already what we're getting from the disruption of crops due to weather extremes in the northern hemisphere. So the question is, what can we do about all this? And in terms of food, it's very hard to see how we can get out of the mess we're in quickly. I mean, in the long run, one can see changing the way people eat and what they eat is very important. But in the short run, there's the Green Revolution, which kept people fed, has sort of run its course. We're getting warming, which we're trying to keep down to 1.5 or 2 degrees, because if warming goes beyond 2 degrees, we see this big drop-off of plant yields, crop yields. We're getting extra disruption due to weather extremes, which become climate extremes if they go on every year in the mid-northern latitudes. So we're really up the creek as far as food production in relation to population. And we're getting this population explosion, which nobody's doing anything about, especially in Africa, with this quadrupling of the population at a time when the continent can't feed itself. So all of those things point to gruesome consequences.